Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Transportation Benefits of Parking Cashout, Pre-Tax Commuter Benefits, and Parking Surtaxes. Today's webinar is co-hosted by TREC in partnership with Leidos Consulting and the Federal Highway Administration. My name is Lisa Patterson, and I will be your moderator for today. I am the Tech Transfer and Workforce Development Program Manager for TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at PSU, Portland State University. TREC houses the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, NITC, and administers the Initiative for Bicycle and Pedestrian Innovation, IBPI, along with other transportation grants and programs. We produce timely, practical research useful to transportation decision makers and support the education of future transportation professionals through curriculum development and student participation in research. All right, our speakers today. We have 4 speakers joining us today. To start off, we have Sonika Sethi with Leidos Consulting, Alan Greenberg with FHWA, James Choe with ICF Strategic Consulting, and Colleen Stoll with City of Santa Monica. Ms. Sonika Sethi, AICP, is a transportation planner specializing in infrastructure finance and economics. She has supported several transportation providers with strategic funding decisions, financial planning for capital investments, and evaluation of policies and grant programs. Ms. Sethi has led complex studies involving analytical methods of project prioritization, evaluation of benefits and costs of investments, performance-based funding allocation, toll financial planning, and fiscal impact analysis. Ms. Sethi also supports the Federal Highway Administration on research in the areas of congestion pricing and connected and autonomous vehicles. Alan Greenberg has 25 years of experience in analyzing and advocating for sustainable U.S. transportation policy at the national and regional levels from both inside and outside of government. As a senior policy analyst at FHWA for the past 17 years, Mr. Greenberg has played a leadership role with the Value Pricing Pilot Program, cultivating, developing, and managing transportation pricing pilot initiatives. Prior to joining FHWA, Mr. Greenberg spent 2 years at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where he had directed the Transportation Partners Program, which provided grants and technical assistance to national not-for-profit organizations that promoted local transportation demand management initiatives. Mr. Greenberg has authored numerous peer-reviewed research papers and articles on pay-as-you-drive insurance, parking pricing, and shared mobility. He holds a Master in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Virginia and a Bachelor of Science in Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon University. James Choe is a transportation policy analyst with ICF, evaluating the impacts of local planning, transportation demand management strategies, and alternative transportation modes on pollutant emissions, public health, and other sustainability indicators. Mr. Choe has assessed the benefits and costs of numerous innovative approaches from reducing VMT and emissions, including parking and commuter benefit strategies for federal, state, and local agencies. And lastly, we have Colleen Stoll. She is the Transportation Demand Management Program Manager for the City of Santa Monica. The TDM program proactively manages congestion, improves air quality, and reduces automobile dependence in Santa Monica. It requires annual trip reduction plans from developers and employers with 10 or more employees. When Santa Monica started the TDM program over 20 years ago, the number of solo drivers driving to work was 80%. Today, that number has been reduced to 62% in the mornings and 58% in the afternoons. Last year, that translated to over 12,300 fewer car trips per day. All right, before I hand it over to our first speaker, I'll give you a brief overview of the webinar. The presenters will talk for about 45 minutes, during which that time you can submit questions, which will be answered at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website. Once the video is processed and uploaded, we will email you a link to the video and presentation slides. If you're tracking continuing education credits, please note that this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will also be included in your post-webinar email. And we have 2 upcoming webinars. One will be on November 9th with Joanna Ganning, who will be presenting what we know about location affordability in U.S. shrinking cities. And on December 4th, we will cover case studies in the FTA manual on pedestrian and bicycle connections to transit, presented by Nathan McNeil with Portland State University. All right, and during the presentation, you may submit questions for our speakers using the questions pane on your control panel. We'll keep track of questions and respond to them at the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, we will send out written responses for any questions left unanswered. All right, and with that, I will hand it over to our first speaker, Sonika, to talk about her research.
Thank you, Lisa. I just wanted to check that you can hear me okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're excited to present the results of the analysis that we conducted. Our team has been conducting for a good portion of the last 2 years now on the expected impact of city-level parking cash-out and transit benefit ordinances. I want to start off by thanking the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University for giving us this opportunity to present our analysis and results. I'm trying to advance the slides. I think this is a question for Lisa, but I'm not being able to. Lisa, do you mind advancing to the first slide? Perfect, thank you. So I wanted to start with laying out what how we defined parking cash out for the purposes of our analysis. How we defined it is as follows. It's basically employers that provide subsidized or free parking to their employees would be required to provide an option to take a cash benefit, which is equivalent in monetary value, to the parking subsidy. So the commuters, the individual commuters, could then use that cash benefit to pay for public transit or another tax-free commute alternative. And then the employee could pocket the rest as taxable cash. Or if the employee were carpooling or bicycling or walking to work, they could pocket the entire amount. So that is how we defined parking cash out for the purposes of our analysis. Although as we go through how we conducted our analysis, you would see the various level of details and complexities that were added to this basic premise of parking cash out. I'm going to try advancing again here. Okay, I think it's one too much. Okay, so the objectives of our study were basically to analyze and evaluate the impact of city-level parking cash-out ordinances and the impact that they could have on vehicle travel. We also evaluated several driving-related externalities, such as delay emissions as part of our analysis. Really at a high level, we wanted to provide a resource that informs city governments and jurisdictions that are probably considering the development of local parking cash-out ordinances on the range of options, laws and policies that are out there that can be used to effect a change on vehicle travel in their jurisdictions. Moving on to the next slide. So in terms of examples of parking cash out law, there's of course the California state law, which is one of the more well-known laws in place. Rhode Island has a state law, and Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., there is a proposed ordinance that is in the development phase, has not been implemented yet. So these are just a few of the examples, that are currently there. There are not many examples of state-level ordinances. There are several examples for employer-provided parking cash-out benefits. We've listed out a few here. There's the Seattle Children's Hospital. City of Austin, Texas has an ordinance and has as a benefit. and Intuit and Google also provide parking cash out benefits to their employees. I just wanted to take a second to mention here that Santa Monica also has a city-level ordinance that expands on the California state law, and Colleen Stoll, who is also a presenter for today's webinar, will be talking about it later in the presentation. Okay, moving to the next slide. So as part of our analysis, we modeled data for 9 cities. The cities are shown on the map on your slide right now. The cities we evaluated were Boston, Chicago, Houston, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, San Diego, and Washington, D.C. We used certain criteria for selecting these 9 cities. Primarily, we were looking at cities with large drive-alone employee populations to be able to see measurable impact in terms of commute driving. We also wanted to look at cities that have high-priced parking. So the employee cash-out benefit is a noticeable benefit to the commuters. Transit mode share was also a factor. We wanted to consider cities that had a high transit mode share, which indicated that transit was a viable option for those switching away from driving to work. And then, of course, we wanted to have cities that had data available to support the analysis. So these were the 9 cities that essentially made that cut. Moving on to the next slide. So this slide provides just a snapshot, a very high-level snapshot of the 6 scenarios or potential ordinances that we analyzed as part of our study. We will be providing more detail about these scenarios in a little bit, but at a high level, this gives a snapshot of who would be affected by the requirement. So all these scenarios would be requirements on employers. So as you see, scenario 1 through 6 would affect employers that are currently offering free or subsidized parking. So all the scenarios affect employers that are offering free and subsidized parking, but only scenarios 4, 5, and 6 affect employers that are not offering free parking. So in effect, 4, 5, and 6 apply to all employers within the jurisdictions. So the next 2 slides are basically going into the details of these scenarios. I'm trying to go to scenario 1. Okay, thank you. So there's 3 scenarios on this slide are ones that affect only employers that offer free or subsidized parking. So scenario 1 is the basic monthly parking cash out scenario, which would require employers to offer employees to cash out their parking on a monthly basis. And the cash out value would be equal to the market rate of monthly parking, but no less than the average cost of riding transit. So this is the basic monthly parking cash out scenario or ordinance. Scenario 2 essentially requires employers to offer employees for whom they're subsidizing parking to also offer tax-exempt transit and van pool benefits up to the maximum allowed by law for each commuter, but not in excess of the value of the parking benefit. So that's scenario 2. Scenario 3 is an incentive for daily cash out added to the scenario 1, which is monthly parking cash out. So under this ordinance, employers would be required to offer monthly cash out, just like scenario 1. And in addition, they would be provided tax credits to offer cash out on a daily instead of a monthly basis. So in effect, an employer or commuter could choose whether to take the parking cash out on a daily basis. The tax credit would have to be sufficiently small or tailored. That is, it would apply only for employees currently offered parking benefits. So that the employers are not encouraged to begin offering parking benefits they had not previously offered. And we'll go into the details of these scenarios as James would run through the analysis as well. So moving on to the next slide. So scenarios 4, 5, and 6 are ones, as I mentioned previously, they apply to all employers out there. So both employers that are currently offering subsidized parking and those that do not. So scenario 4 is the monthly parking cash out plus a pre-tax transit option for employees without subsidized parking. So so it requires that employers that offer subsidized parking also offer parking cash out, just like in scenario 1, but it requires, additionally it requires all other employers to make a pre-tax transit option available to all employees. So so in these two parts, it addresses both types of employers. Scenario 5 is an incentive to eliminate subsidized parking altogether. So this ordinance would use a tax credit to encourage employers to stop subsidizing parking and to begin offering employer-paid transit and van pool benefits. Or in case for employers that do not currently subsidize parking, to begin offering transit or van pool benefits. Scenario 6 is a peak parking surtax. Scenario 6 is a little different from the other scenarios in that it is a requirement on parking providers and not on employers. So what scenario 6 would require would be for parking providers to charge a surtax on parking fees during peak periods. So if you were a commuter who used the parking space during peak periods, you came in the morning peak period of 7 to 9 a.m. and left 4:30 to 6 p.m., you would pay $3 per use during peak period for a total of up to $6 in a day. So the scenario, as you can see, is slightly different from the others in that it would encourage employees to travel during off-peak periods rather than shifting modes. So in a sense, it's a congestion charge. So these are all the 6 scenarios that we analyze as part of our analysis. I would like to hand over to James now to go through the inputs and outputs of our analysis.
Thanks, Sonika. So I'm James Choe. I'm with ICF, and I helped with the technical analysis for all of these scenarios. And so I get the honor of leading you through some of the more technical details about how we ran the analysis, what went into each scenario, and just give you an overview. There's going to be a lot of information on these slides, but we'll be providing, you'll be able to get a copy of these slides, but we just wanted to give you a taste of what went into the analysis. So first of all, we wanted to give you a chance to understand some of the key inputs that went into our analyses. And I'm going to talk about, on the left side, there's the column of key inputs. I'm going to talk about a number of these in more detail, but these are, of course, some of them shouldn't be a surprise. For example, the employee population, what's the number of employees we're working with who might be impacted by these policies? What are the commute characteristics, such as mode share? And it's the travel cost factors that really drive the behavior change. And so what are some of the starting and ending costs, travel costs that we're working with? And then the travel elasticities to estimate what is the relationship between the driving behavior and the price cost change. We're running this model across, as Sonika mentioned, 9 different cities. And across the cities, there's going to be variations, not just in the inputs, but we wanted to adjust for, to be as accurate as possible where we could. For example, as Sonika mentioned, there is an existing California CashOut law, and only a portion of employees or employers are participating in it. But we wanted to make an adjustment for those cities in California to make some assumption about how many employees are already being offered cash out, because that will affect the outputs. We also know that a number of employees already offer commuter benefits to their employees, and so we wanted to make adjustments there. And then there's all sorts of different taxation rules in the different cities, and so we made adjustments there. Key outputs that we were analyzing or coming out of our analysis, which Alan will talk about the specific results, but just to give you an idea of what we were trying to estimate, of course, the reduction in vehicle miles traveled is a key output. Additionally, related to the VMT reduction is reduction in congestion and emissions. And then finally, we wanted to estimate what might be the parking reductions in parking infrastructure costs, essentially from avoided parking. So an example of some of the key inputs, just to give you an idea, I'm showing inputs from 4 cities that we analyzed. And these are cities where we had regional data from a regional travel survey. So generally our approach was where we could find local or regional data, input data, we used that. Where we didn't have that specific data, we used national figures we could gather or proxy values from other places. And what this gives you a sense of is, you know, the different scenarios, these different inputs will have will experience very different impacts for the same scenarios depending on the characteristics of travel in each city. For example, New York City has, we found from the travel survey, has a high drive-alone mode share for employees who have access to free parking, but it's much higher. But when you look at the general population of employees, the drive-alone mode share is much smaller. And so that makes a huge difference when it comes down to analyzing or estimating some of the impacts of these scenarios. Other examples of key inputs, I mentioned the employee population is a key factor, and so that's on the top half of the slide. What you see there for the 9 cities we looked at with the employee populations we were working with, and we highlighted in red what the highest value for each travel characteristic was, or employee population characteristic. And then in green is the lowest value for that characteristic of our 9 cities. And so New York, and this is worth noting, in New York, for example, which has the highest employee population in the cities we looked at, because it has the smallest share of employees who are offered free parking, the number of employees who have access to fully subsidized parking is actually the smallest of our 9 cities. And Los Angeles actually has the highest number of employees who have free parking, and this makes a difference when you're looking at the different scenarios, whether it's a parking cash out strategy or another strategy. At the bottom half shows you parking rates that we were using as inputs. We had monthly parking rates for the central business district from each of the cities. This was data pulled from a Colliers International report. And again, we highlighted in red where the highest value was out of our 9 cities, and then in green is the lowest, and probably not too surprising, the highest values we saw were New York compared to Indianapolis with the lowest. Other key assumptions that are worth noting that impact our analysis. We based our analysis on current conditions. We didn't estimate, forecast future employment populations or driving patterns or emission rates. We use current conditions because we didn't have any sense to pick a future year. We just assumed current year. We assume full adoption and compliance of each ordinance, as you can imagine, depending on how an ordinance is set up or enforced, you may or may not have full compliance. And so we assumed that there was full compliance for all the scenarios. In 2 of the scenarios, as Sonika mentioned, we didn't assume that all employers would offer the policy being analyzed, but we assumed that there was some tax credit that would incentivize the employer to offer this. And so we assumed 20% of employees would be offered those policies in those 2 scenarios. We also assume no transit capacity restrictions. We assume no transit capacity restrictions. So in a number of our studies or scenarios, we estimated a large shift from, for example, driving to transit. But we didn't limit how much could shift to transit. We just assumed that there was sort of an endless capacity. And then the price elasticity of travel demand we used is -0.3. And since that's a key rate that's in our analysis, I wanted to mention in a little more detail. So we did a literature review, extensive literature review to look at what are some of the elasticities in the research. And they range from -0.08 to -0.39, which is a big variation. You use either end of that range and you're going to get pretty different results. So we looked at a couple of studies, including a meta-analysis that really looked at a number of studies and compared them. And that, along with a couple other studies, we pinpointed a value of -0.30 as a reasonable estimate for the elasticity that we used in the study. One final assumption I want to mention is one of the outputs I mentioned that we were trying to estimate from the analysis is the impact of these policies on congestion. And so we pulled a study from San Francisco that modeled scenarios that were very similar to scenarios that we were looking at. And from the study, we found that there was the congestion, the delay reductions were about 1.5 times higher than the VMT reductions in the scenarios. And so we use that as essentially a multiplier, but we scaled it down depending on the city based on their baseline congestion amounts. And we use that multiplier to estimate the congestion reduction based off of the VMT reductions that we calculated. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of the scenarios and the technical analysis that went into it. And this is just a high-level view. There's a lot of details that went into each scenario, but just to give you an idea of our analysis approach, I'm going to talk briefly about each one. So scenario 1 is sort of sets the tone for all of our analyses, or most of our analyses. We use a 2-pronged approach in this scenario and a number of the other scenarios. We used the TRIMS model, which comes out of the University of South Florida, which is a easy-to-use model to estimate the impacts of TDM strategies and pricing strategies. And so we use the CashOut price, the parking price, essentially as an opportunity cost of parking to input into the model to estimate the mode share and trip changes. We also calculated using the elasticity I was mentioning earlier. We used that directly based on the % change in the trip cost. We estimated using that elasticity to estimate the impact on travel. And because we didn't have a strong sense of that one approach was better than the other, we actually averaged these results to estimate our final impact of each scenario, or the scenario one. Scenario two, again, this is the scenario in which instead of employees who are offered free parking get a cash out offer, they're offered instead a transit or van pull benefit. So we did this in a similar method as scenario one, where we used both the TRIMS model and an elasticity calculation. And but it was using a different price change, looking at the change in transit cost based on a commuter benefit. And what we did was, from our approach, we isolated the shift to transit to estimate the change in driving trips. And in this, we set this up in a way where we estimate, we assume a smaller impact than scenario one, assuming that an employee offered a cash out offer is more likely to take that rather than a transit benefit. Scenario three, this is on top of scenario one of the monthly cash out. As Sonika mentioned, there's a daily cash out option. So this is a little bit more flexible option for employees where they can choose on a daily basis whether they use their parking and get cash in lieu of that of parking. And so this is one of the scenarios that we've talked about, that instead of assuming all employers offer this daily cash out option, we assume that 20% of employees are offered this daily cash out option. And our analysis approach was based on a study out of Minneapolis, where they modeled and piloted a similar type of scenario in which employees were offered a daily cash out option in lieu of the monthly paid parking. And so based on that, we estimated a reduction, additional reduction due to a daily cash out option. Scenario four, this is essentially where all employees win. If they're offered free parking, then they are offered cash outs, and then everyone else is offered transit benefits. So this is on top of scenario one results. We assume that the pre-tax transit option would reduce the transit price, and using an elasticity we pulled from literature review, we were able to estimate what would be the change in transit trips based on the reduction in transit costs. Scenario five was a rather aggressive scenario in which employers will cut their free parking to their employees, and instead would offer transit benefits, not only to those who are offered free parking, but to all employees. They would be offered a transit van pull benefit. So this is one of the two scenarios that we've talked about, where instead of assuming all employers would offer this strategy, we assume 20% of employees work for employers that would be offered this benefit. And so we used a very similar approach to scenario one with a two-pronged approach. And but we were dealing with a number of subpopulations here. Some employee populations were already being offered cash out in California, and we assumed a different price change. They were exposed to a different price change versus those employees who are not offered any free parking but are offered a transit benefit will be faced with a different trip cost. And so we did the two-pronged approach analysis to each of those subpopulations with different transit or trip costs, and summed all the results from that. And finally, like Sonika mentioned, the last scenario is a little bit different than the others. This is a peak parking tax, surtax. Again, it's not targeted towards employees who are offered free parking, and it's time-based. And so, again, we assumed in our scenario that there is a fee of up to $6 on top of parking, even if you're offered free parking. And the way we estimated this is we looked at a number of studies, and we used a study out of the Puget Sound region where they actually used GPS devices to model what would be the impact of different types of pricing policies, including a peak toll driving a mileage price. And so using that, they actually developed elasticities in their study, and we used one of the elasticities to then estimate what would be the impact of an additional $6 fee on top of driving cost to estimate what would be the reduction in peak trips. And we assumed that there was essentially two possible responses from drivers to a peak charge. They can either completely shift out of driving to another mode, or they can shift their driving outside of peak. And so from the study, we estimated that about we expect a quarter of the peak trips reductions actually to be a shift to a new mode, so no longer driving, and the remaining 3/4 were shifting to driving at non-peak times. So that was just, again, a taste of what went into our analysis for each of the scenarios and the various inputs that we were using. What I'm going to do is pass it on to Alan at this point to give you a sense of what our results look like.
Thanks, James. Just to let everyone know, the PSRC study, it was real. People were actually charged money. There were about 300 people, and so it was. We thought it provided a good data set for us. Okay, so we're going to present the results in a number of different ways, and I would encourage people to take the PowerPoint afterwards and to study them a little bit more, because we're going to be going through them rather quickly. I've been trying to advance to the next one, and it doesn't seem to be doing it, so maybe I can ask someone else to do it. Okay, great. So the first way we show the results is through focusing on each of the scenarios. I just want to sort of bring your attention to sort of some high-level things. First of all, the overall results are quite high. These are reductions in citywide commute VMT, and you can see from the left side that most of the reductions fall within this sort of 7 to 15% range. Some are a little under that, and some are higher. You can also see that the basic CashOut scenario 1 has pretty high results. 3 and 4, because they add things, have somewhat higher results, and the results are somewhat less for the other scenarios, but they're useful to explore and study a little bit further. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a few summary bullets. So slide 3, you had greater results because, again, 20% of the employees were offered the daily option. Slide 2, you would expect lower results, as James said, because the incentive level is lower and it only applies to those shifting in transit rather than to other modes. Scenario 4, you're layering on, again, the pre-tax transit benefit, which on top of those who are getting the cash out, so you would expect to see some benefit there. It's a low value, but it still has some impact. Next slide, please. Scenario 5 is one thing to think about. Even though it showed the lowest numbers on that bar chart, it actually applied only to 20% of employees, so 80% of employees were exempt entirely. For those who it does apply to, though, the results are quite substantial. And later, we end showing a next slide, please. We end showing the actual numbers, and you'll see in there we show both the 20% tax credit take-up rate numbers and what if you actually got 100% take-up in the scenarios 3 and 5. Finally, scenario 6, we saw a modest, but on the lower side, at least compared to the other scenarios, reduction in VMT. But I want to highlight the point that James made in looking at the PSRC study. About 3/4 of the reduced driving in the peak time occurred because people were shifting their driving time. So you're going to see a modest VMT reduction, but a big reduction in VMT during the period that you're most concerned about, the congestion time. And We'll really see that when we get to our very last slide, which is, and next slide please, which is the slide on the congestion reduction. This is just shown a different way. This just lets you see your city. You know, some cities had larger results than others, and they are aligned according to sort of what was discussed before. You could see, for instance, the biggest results are in Boston, and LA and Philly had very large results as well. Small results in places like Houston, relatively small results, Houston and New York City. Next slide. And this slide that is going to kind of itemizes again that where you have higher VMT reductions related to both a high parking price, but also the TRIMS model makes adjustments in terms of its output based on what your initial drive alone mode share is. So if you have a low drive alone mode share, the assumption of that model is that you're getting, you have a transportation environment that enables alternatives, and you'll see a larger shift. Alternatively, when you have high drive alone mode shares, or you have few employees that are actually receiving the subsidy, like in New York, you're going to not have as many either impacted directly, or we don't expect the impact to be as great because of land use characteristics. Next slide. Okay, so in this slide, we're actually sort of laying all the results out. Again, you see that the monthly scenario has a pretty robust result. Scenario 2 somewhat lower, but not insubstantial, and that's a key thing. If that's what you could get through in your city to start out, that's a pretty good place to start. Scenario 3, the tax credit, a modest boost, but if you actually apply daily cash out everywhere, which if the city had a lot of experience over time after, say, a tax credit was implemented and was successful, you could see even greater numbers. Scenario 4, as I noted, some little uptick in the results from scenario 1. Scenario 5 is really interesting to show here because you saw the bar chart that the numbers were fairly low in the 20% one, but if you actually were to do that, that is, if you were to prohibit employers from subsidizing parking and required employers to subsidize transit, you would have the largest numbers here. That's probably not politically realistic in most places, but it's useful to sort of see what its impacts would be. And the last one, scenario 6, again, this has, I want you to take a kind of mental note of that one, and then when we go to the next slide, you'll see how much higher that is, because that's the peak surcharge. So if we look at the next slide, the other numbers are roughly quite similar, actually, to what their VMT reductions were, the congestion reductions. And there's mathematical reasons to explain that are fairly complicated. There's some reasons that the numbers went up a lot and some reasons that they went down a lot, and it kind of was a wash. So roughly in most of the scenarios up to 6, your VMT reduction was about your congestion reduction. And we had that multiplier that James talked about. That's the reason it went up, but it went down because there's other peak period trips that are happening that are not commute trips. And then finally, though, you have an awful lot of impact on congestion with scenario 6. Again, that's the surcharge that you apply in the case of people entering or exiting parking at peak periods. Okay, last slide of mine just shows our contact information. It's all there. We welcome contact you all getting to us. But I want to pass it on to Colleen. Colleen's the one who really has the practical experience and really a lot of insights. It was a member of our review group, and really can say something about getting employers to actually offer these things, and rather than sort of the analysis that we did. So thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, I'm Colleen Stoll, the TDM manager for the City of Santa Monica, and I'm going to share a little bit about how we've implemented the California parking cash-out law that was referenced earlier in the presentation. Went too far. Okay, so the California state law went into effect in 1993, and in general, the law is similar to scenario 1 from the study, but it is limited in its applicability. So first of all, it only applies to employers who have 50 or more employees who are located in a non-attainment air basin. The employer has to subsidize parking that they don't own. They need to be able to determine the value of the parking subsidy, and they also need to be able to reduce the number of parking spaces that they lease without penalty. So the thought is that if an employee is electing to receive the parking cash out in lieu of a subsidized parking space, then the employer can just reduce the number of parking spaces that they're leasing, and instead of leasing that parking space, they can give the money to their employee, and they take that money for not driving alone to work and utilize the parking space. And so it's pretty much a wash for their employer. They're just shifting who they pay the money to. But the challenge that we have in California is that there's little enforcement of the state law. So here in Santa Monica, we've taken on the enforcement component at the local level by incorporating parking cash out into our transportation demand management ordinance. So through our TDM ordinance, we require employers with 30 or more employees to submit an annual emission reduction plan to the city. And we're similar to the other Southern California cities that were in the PowerPoint in that a majority of our employers fully subsidize employee parking. So if an employer subsidizes parking and they meet those other criteria that I just mentioned, then that employer has to provide parking cash out and show proof of providing that as part of their emission reduction plan that they submit to the city. If they don't submit a plan to the city, or if parking cash out applies and they don't include it, then we don't approve their plan, and then they'd be subject to fines from us of up to $5 per employee per day, and potentially even revocation of their business license. But we're here to help employers with that. So we help them establish their parking cash out program. One of the first things we do is help them determine the value of the cash out, because quite often our employers who are subject to the law, they piece together their parking supply. They might own some parking, they might lease 20 spaces from one company, 30 spaces from another company. So the cash out that they give is equal to a blend of their parking costs. So they would average out the parking that they own that's free in their leased parking spaces, and then it depends on how much you subsidize your employee parking, and then that's what your cash out needs to be on a monthly basis. So we help them with that. We also help with one of the things that we really like about the state law is that an employer can require an employee to sign a parking cash out agreement in order to receive the incentive, and that's going to prevent spillover parking from happening as a result of the cash out. So we help employers with a template for that cash out agreement that they use with their employees who want to participate in the program. And so basically when the employee signs the template, they're saying that not only am I not going to take the parking space that my employer is providing, but I'm also not going to just drive alone to the work site and park on the neighboring streets. And that's definitely a big issue for us here in Santa Monica. So we like that we have this option of preventing the spillover parking. The agreement does take into account that employees may need to drive to work occasionally, and so that specifies the number of days per month that the employee may drive to work. And that really depends on the employee's schedule, but typically it's between 2 to 5 days per month. But then if the employee is going to be driving to work 2 to 5 days per month, the employer is going to have to set aside some parking that's basically used for that occasional parking use, and we'll help them think about how they need to administer those spaces. So similar to the results of the study, we found that parking cash out, when it's offered, is the single most effective TDM measure that can be provided by an employer. And part of that is just because it's so flexible. It is supporting all of the non-drive-alone options, not just a specific mode. But we do struggle with applicability in Santa Monica because so many of our employers occupy spaces where the parking that they lease is bundled into their overall building lease agreement, and they aren't able to decrease the number of parking spaces that they lease. So that's one of the reasons why with our new development, we've switched to unbundled parking so that then when an employer, then the employers are only leasing the number of parking spaces that they need, and then they'd be able to implement the parking cash out program because when they need a fewer number of parking spaces, they'd be able to they'd be able to change their lease agreement. And then, so that's a barrier for on the employer side. On the employee side, one of the barriers that we see is that participants are having to commit to giving up their parking space full time. So for employees who are considering new commute options, they might be willing to try the new commute option occasionally, but they might need to drive to work more than the 2 to 5 times per month that's allowed by the parking cash-out agreement. So to address this barrier, employers in new developments, again, are going to be required to provide a daily parking cash-out that was more similar to scenario 3 from the study. And we're hoping that will encourage more occasional participation. It won't be such a steep barrier for employees who are considering this. And I think that's the end of my summary of where parking cash out is in Santa Monica today, and I'm going to hand it back over to Lisa, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks have. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sonika, Alan, and James, and Colleen. For those of you viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them, but it does look like we have a few questions from the audience already. So why don't we start with Colleen? There's a couple questions that came up from your presentation. Did unbundling building leases and parking require a city ordinance?
We just recently updated our zoning ordinance in 2015, and that's when we made the change to unbundled parking.
Okay. And one more follow-up question, Colleen, before we open it up here to the other presenters. Is there a requirement in Santa Monica if the employer owns their own parking, can they change their own employees to park there, charge their own employees to park there?
They can, yes. And there has often been the request that we require employers to charge their employees for parking, but if it's owned parking that they have and then they charge their employees to use it, there's not a mechanism that we have similar to parking cash out where we can say, no, you can't just go park on the neighboring street. And so we see spillover parking, so that's why we are hesitant to say, employer, you must charge your employees to use the parking that you own and have on site.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, and this is a question for any of our presenters, so feel free to chime in, anyone. Do you anticipate the proposed changes to the federal tax code will affect these scenarios? Would raising the standard deduction make most of these incentives irrelevant?
Well, we haven't seen a tax bill per se, but the question, though, is employers are now offering. So the question is, employers can offer this benefit to employees tax-free. So the parking, I don't know if there's any changes that are going to be proposed here, but assuming not, this is really about the benefits that the employer would offer to the employee. So I'm not aware of anything that's being discussed that would substantially impact this, but perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Great. Move on to the next question. So, Colleen, in one of your slides, you had mentioned that the most effective TDM measure was the cash-out parking. For perspective, could you mention what other effective TDM measures?
Sure. So we have transit pass subsidies that folks give out. They provide amenities on site like fleets of bikes that their employees can use during the day. So if they've come to work without a vehicle, they have a bicycle that's available on site that they could use. Folks have contracts with folks like Uber and Lyft to use the Uber pool and Lyft line facilities where it's the shared ride trip to work. So in the morning, employees can just open up Uber and Lyft and see their employer account and say, hey, my employer is going to pay for my shared ride trip to work. You know, we have really creative industries here, and they offer all types of incentives from movie screenings to free meals and bike tune-ups. But again, we see that parking cash out, it's so universally, it can apply to any mode that somebody's choosing, and so it tends to be the most desirable.
Great. This question is for Alan. Does FHWA offer any resources to city governments interested in transportation demand management programs?
It's a good question. Well, this study was meant to be a resource to city governments in terms of providing some analysis. Probably not as much as we should. I mean, we have division offices that do some outreach. We have a active ATDM program, active travel demand management program, where we're developing tools that we think may be useful. You know, I would think that the team here would be quite willing to talk to not only the cities. In fact, I'd like to. My hope is to make presentations in the cities where we've made where we focus the study, but also we would like to. We'd be happy to get inquiries from other cities if they wanted to do some similar analysis. I think it would be a lot less of an effort now that we figured out how to do it in new cities than it took us to do what we did here.
Great. And for those that have joined after, we will be sending the presentation slides and the video recording out in a post-webinar email. So I'm sure Alan would be glad to answer any questions if you would like to email him directly or access any of those tools. All right. And so we have time for a couple more questions. This one is for Colleen again. Was there any pushback on the town ordinances? Was the Chamber of Commerce in favor? And if not, initially, how did you address this?
We really didn't have much pushback from our business community, and other folks have asked how that was. I think one of the things that worked to our benefit is when we updated our TDM ordinance, it was the same time that we were updating the rest of our zoning ordinance to align with our new land use and circulation element. And there were so many other things that were being looked at during those 30-plus community meetings that we had, including parking requirements that I would almost say kind of fell under the radar. We did, since we already have a 20-year relationship with all of the employers that we've been regulating, we did reach out to all the employers and we let them know, hey, we're changing our ordinance. You know, come to these public hearings, and we maybe had a couple of folks that came. Many of them do see that we are trying to increase the number of folks that can come to their businesses and to their restaurants and to their companies. Mm-hmm. And so they see that this is an attempt to help them increase the number of people who are coming to their businesses, not decrease the number of people coming. So they were generally supportive.
Great. This is semi-related to some of the policy that you had mentioned. Did the City of Santa Monica need to pass any state legislation to implement a city-based TMD ordinance?
No, we have an MOU with the Air Quality Management District, and that's what allows us to implement the AQMD's Rule 2202 at the local level. So not a state law, but a partnership with AQMD.
Mm-hmm. Great. And just one final question, and perhaps, you know, all the presenters can chime in too on more of a global assessment, but I'll start out with Colleen. I think it's really interesting, this webinar, to present the research and the analysis that went behind it, but then to hear, you know, a program implementing some of these strategies. So one viewer had a question about how much you were able to decrease your VMTs and SOVs through this program, and perhaps the other presenters could even expand that on what they've seen on other case studies for similar programs.
Yeah, and it's hard for us to specifically call out parking cash out alone because our employers that we regulate implement a variety of scenarios. And so statistically, it's hard to say, okay, the measurement that we use here in Santa Monica is average vehicle ridership, and it's hard for us to attribute that change in average vehicle ridership specifically to parking cash out unless it's a company, let's say, that had a certain set of TDM measures in place and then all of a sudden started leasing parking and had to do a cash out, and so cash out was the only thing that was added, and that just typically does not happen. Typically parking cash out is bundled with a bunch of other things that they offer. But we are going to try and dig into our data and see if we can pinpoint companies where parking cash out was the only thing that they added, and then look at the change in results. I'll be happy to share that with this group when we do that analysis.
And if I could chime in on the relationship to that question of the study, there has been some implementation, and we looked at the results of that, and that certainly informed our study. The biggest one, Dr. Donald Choe from UCLA, there were eight sites in Southern California, but there were also smaller studies in Washington State and Minneapolis as well. And this isn't, it wasn't mandatory, but these were employers that chose to implement the strategy. The other thing more broadly is we really, really tried to be as accurate as possible, and we tried to be very, very careful. So we made a lot of adjustments to the study to not overstate the benefits. We have to remember, for instance, that some employers are already offering transit benefits, so we didn't want to, if we essentially required that with our scenario, we didn't want to count that twice. We had some employers in California that were already offering cash out because of the limited state law. We made an effort to not count that twice. I think all of our results were based on studies. There were some of them that we were perhaps a little less confident in than others. For instance, the daily cash out result was based on a single small study. We prefer, if we had it, to have better data on that one. But we really tried to make as many adjustments and used anything we could find that would inform our study. And indeed, cash out has been, it's not like it's never been done before. So we did our best, but we'd love to see what actually happens if cities implemented these strategies, and we'd love to have some before-after numbers on that.
Great, thanks so much for adding that. Well, thank you again, Sonika, Alan, James, and Colleen, for sharing your work, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This does conclude our webinar. You can view our other professional developed offerings on our website at trek.pdx.edu, and we will be sending out the slides and the video in our post-webinar email. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.